Hi, good evening, everyone. Great crowd for a dismal Wednesday night, afternoon, morning, pre-morning. It's so great to have you all here. My name is Richard Reyes-Gavilan. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Public Library. I want to welcome you all to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library here in beautiful downtown Washington, DC. Let me start by announcing a regrettable change to our program this evening. We build this event as a conversation between our guest author and the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. Unfortunately, last night we were informed that Dr. Hayden has a family emergency that will preclude her from participating in tonight's conversation. Fear not, the conversation will move forward, and I'm more than happy to fill in for Dr. Hayden. Those of you who know me know that while I may not be as engaging as Dr. Hayden, I'm also not as smart. So just a couple of plugs for some library programs. We always have tons of great events scheduled at the MLK Library, and I'll mention just a couple. This coming Sunday, March 10th, we welcome photographer Jim Saw for the release of the second edition of In My Eyes, the punk photography of Jim Saw. Jim will be here to discuss his iconic images of DC's early punk scene from the 1980s and 90s. Eric, you may not know, we have a phenomenal DC punk archive here in the library, so we try to support it with programs like this. Joining Jim in conversation will be founder of Discord Records, former Minor Threat and Fugazi frontman, and friend of DC Public Library, Ian Mackay. And on Wednesday, March 27th, at the end of the month, we will welcome National Book Award and Penn Hemingway Award finalist Lisa Coe, who will be here to discuss her latest novel memory piece. For more details and more programs here and at our 25 locations around town, please visit dclibrary.org. I'd like to thank Politics and Prose Bookstore for partnering with us on tonight's program. They've got copies for sale over in the Great Hall as you walk in or as you walk out. I'd also like to thank the DC Public Library Foundation for providing copies of 2020 to some of tonight's early arrivers. Susan Haight is over there, the co-president of the DC Public Library Foundation. Thank you, Susan, for being here. I'd also like to recognize two members of the DC Public Library Board of Trustees who've joined us tonight, Leif Dormsjo and Andrew Trueblood. Thanks, gentlemen, for being here tonight. Okay, so we are truly, truly thrilled to have Eric Klinenberg, champion of libraries, Eric Klinenberg, here with us tonight. His new book, 2020, One City, Seven People, and the Year Everything Changed, is a fascinating reflection not only on the first year of the COVID pandemic and on the lives of some remarkable yet ordinary New Yorkers, but an amazing sociological investigation of Americans and our unique behaviors as compared to people in other parts of the world. Eric Klinenberg is Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's the author of Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. You got a new t-shirt tonight. I've got to say, if you can look closely, Eric is wearing a Palaces for the People MLK Library t-shirt.
Right.
That's a size medium. You can get it for $23. No, I'm just.
By the way, I changed before that. It's never happened to me before where I come to the talk and in the waiting room they're like, you have to change. I wore a very nice button-down shirt. No, I actually volunteered to change. It's so flattering to have a T-shirt with your book title on it.
That's all you, man.
I'm going to be here every night, just sitting in the table over there with this T-shirt.
He's also the author of Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, and Heatwave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago. I don't know who writes your subtitles, but they really are the best subtitles going. He's also the co-author with Aziz Ansari of New York Times #1 bestseller, Modern Romance. He has also published widely in scholarly journals and also the popular press. Please join me in welcoming Eric Klinenberg.
Thanks. Thank you. You just made me nervous because the one book that was the #1 bestseller of the New York Times has no subtitle.
Well,
so I'm doing all this stuff for no reason, apparently.
Yeah. Well, you were only the co-author.
Yeah.
So the other guy.
That's even worse, Rich.
The other guy was supposed to take care of the subtitle, I think.
All right.
Great. So we'll have a few questions, and we'd love to open it up to you all, so you can help me out while we all fill in for Dr. Hayden tonight. Eric, I think the fundamental question that I think everyone wants to know is why write a book about 2020 now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Why should we go back to 2020? I'm sure everybody here was pretty happy when 2020 ended. And it's the way you talk about the rain. It was like if there's like the witch in the Wizard of Oz who melts when the water gets on her. You made it sound like everybody in DC was going to melt if they got rain on tonight. But you all, it'll be a good night to be home, right? Just like in a warm place, and you've all come out to talk about the year 2020. So I think it's good, but we should ask ourselves why, what we're doing here. And I want to answer that a few different ways. So the first way I want to answer this has to do with like a Washington, D.C. issue around politics. Because I was sitting in my living room a few months ago, and the previous president was on television. And he said this incredible thing. He said, he was doing a rally in New Hampshire, and he said at the rally, I want all of you to ask yourselves, are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? And I thought about that, and something felt funny about it, right? And I realized that actually for generations, political candidates in his position have been asking that same question, except that he didn't get the line right? I mean, like the line is supposed to be, if you're him, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, right? Because he was in office then. But it turns out it wasn't like an error. It wasn't a mistake. He had been saying this as part of his stump speech. And then I realized it's actually a very strategic thing that comes with a theory behind it. And the theory behind it is what happened in 2020 shouldn't count. It's an anomaly. Like don't hold that against me in my record. If it weren't for 2020, things would have been great, right? And a lot of people actually buy into that theory, and I find it really fascinating because, like, my theory of the world is a little bit different. It's that, we live at a time when there are crises, and there's a lot of crises that are cascading. Like 2020, and you should know, like the book, this book I wrote is not just a book about COVID. It's a book about the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officers. It's a book about this incredible civil rights uprising and the movement for Black lives. It's a book about the economic free fall that the country found itself in. It's a book about the flight from cities. It's a book about the spike in violence, and it's a book about the attack on democratic institutions that we experienced around the election of 2020, right? So these cascading crises. But the next president we have, whomever we elect, is taking office at a time when there's, Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Gaza, potentially nuclear Iran, China and Taiwan, global warming, right? AI, maybe another pathogen. So it seems to me like when we think about who we want to be our next leader, one of the things we want to look at is, well, how equipped is this person to handle crises, right? In other words, like 2020 is exactly like, we should be thinking about, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And there's this weird amnesia about the year, this kind of will. I think of it in my work as a will not to know about what we went through. And this leads me to the second reason I think it's important for us to have this conversation. We experienced so much in 2020, there's so much trauma that I think just at a very basic human level, this isn't political, just like in order to get through it, we all had to kind of like get these little black boxes and pack everything in it and move them into the closet and not think about all the things that we were going through. Like just at a human level, I don't know if anybody else felt this way. It was like a very scary time in the world. And it could be scary because you worried about your own personal health. The real trauma began for me. I had a 13-year-old at the time. He's now 17, and he's an athlete and he's super energetic. He never is tired. And I came home from a trip in early March and he had a fever and he was sweating at night and he had a headache and he was just like completely exhausted. He could not get off the couch. And it lasted for 7 days. And at the time, there were these reports about, the children with the inflammation syndrome, and we didn't know like who was really susceptible to COVID. And I, as a father, I found it really terrifying. Do you remember this? The recommendation that we got from health officials at the time was like, if someone in your family might have COVID, and of course we couldn't know if anybody had COVID because we live in the United States of America, and there were no tests. So the advice was, put that person in a room by themselves. You remember this? And close the door. And you can like slide food in under the door. And I guess I understood that advice intellectually, but like as a parent with a kid who might have this disease that people are dying from, you're just completely unable to do that. So then you're in the room, in the bed, but wondering whether you're making everything dangerous. So like we all had this trauma. And I think what's happened is that we're kind of beyond what people call the acute phase of the pandemic, but because we've boxed everything up and turned away from it, I think we're living through what I like to think of as long COVID, not long COVID as a medical condition, but long COVID as a kind of social disease. It's just like it's still in us. And there's a way in which this experience of 2020, it accelerated all these things happening in the country, the distrust, right, the division, the sense of anger, the feeling of being kind of on our own, and it hardened them. And because we've moved away from it, like we're still agitated. And I think it's really important for us to talk about it. And then the last thing, and we'll make this actually a conversation, is that for years, a big idea that's motivated a lot of my research as a social scientist is the idea that crises are important to study because crises reveal things. If we look closely at what happens in a crisis, we can see who we are, we can see what we value, we can see whose lives matter, right? And so we're used to this idea, especially you in DC, that never let a crisis go to waste is what the political officials say, right? And in a way, I think social scientists can do that too. Like we can learn a tremendous amount about ourselves from like slowing down and just focusing on the things we did as the world is kind of falling apart. And that's the thing I really insist on in this book. And actually, to be honest, like even as someone who's trying to record everything as we went through it, like the revelations were pretty profound.
The notion that you talked about, the collective long COVID, that was sort of epiphanical for me when I read about it. It's like, we've got the same two guys running for president again, right? It's almost like nothing has changed. The anxiety that we're feeling, that more or less were born from the pandemic are still with us.
Yeah.
I mean, we feel safer, right, to be in a room together. But at the same time, all the psychological, anxiety, for me and my family and for all of you guys is probably still there in some way, shape, or form.
No, I think we're agitated, and it shapes our politics. I mean, I think we see. I mean, like we're not where we were. Like kids are still not going to school. I don't know if you're tracking this, but like truancy levels are incredibly high, and we just learned from some journalism a few weeks ago, teachers aren't going to school, right? People are not back in their offices. Cities don't have the same sense of solidity that they had before then. We're still trying to figure out this kind of doom loop problem. Again, like, living in New York City, I know about these families whose kids are going to schools for really high achieving young people. And even in the classes for the most, academically successful kids who are heading to, competitive, demanding universities, about 20 to 30% of the kids are able to take the exams in the room where they have the classes, and something like 70% of the kids are taking all the exams in a special room because so many kids in school are suffering from anxiety and attention issues, like that all got whipped up and accelerated in the pandemic. And we talk a lot about the phones and the problem with the phones. And as a parent of teenagers, I'm very sympathetic to the problem of phones, but it's deeper than the phones, you know? It's not just a phone problem.
So a minute ago, you talked about all the sort of cascading crises from 2020. You don't write just about COVID. You write about the murder of George Floyd. You write about issues of trust. From your perspective as a sociologist, what can we learn now from looking at the crises of that year?
Okay, so I made this argument, like crises reveal something about who we are, and I want to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that, and hopefully this will be instructive. So one of the things that we're able to see more clearly in 2020 has to do with this whole situation of what happens when, you know, the economy is falling apart and it doesn't feel safe to be at home. And some of you might remember there was this moment, like in early March, where we closed the schools and we really didn't understand this new virus. I was in New York City, so there's a lot of exposure, a lot of vulnerability. But across the country, we did this thing, which is we said, you should really stay home if you can. We want people to stay at home. And the only people, do you remember this? The only people who should go to their jobs and work, remember this? We came up with this concept. We have a new category of people in the world, and they're called, remember? Essential workers, right? But I'm just curious, how many of you feel like in the last several years you spent a huge amount of time talking about essential workers? Okay, 3, 4, 5 people. We're gonna find out they all work in labor here. They're all like, right? So basically, nobody's been talking about essential workers. Let's talk about essential workers for a minute, because I think this, like, sociologically is one of the most fascinating things that happened. All right, New York City. I know who the essential workers are in New York City, right? They're the finance guys, right? The bankers, right? Now there's like the tech community in New York City. There's the white shoe law firms, and there's the Knicks, right? And like that's certainly how we compensate people, right? I mean, like they're the ones who are essential. They're the ones who are compensated well and taken care of. They're the kings of the city. And when push came to shove, and there was really a question about, like, what do we really need to function as a society, right? Like, how are we going to get food to people? How are we going to make sure that, you know, people can get to the hospital to work? And how are we going to make sure that basic goods get delivered for, you know, diapers and things like that? Here are the people who turn out to be essential, right? It's like the farm workers, people in meatpacking plants, poultry workers, obviously the health workers, you know, medical doctors being at the top of that hierarchy, nurses, custodians, kitchen workers, the clerks in the grocery store, right? The delivery people, the people who work in the transit system, people who do building maintenance, custodians, right? So suddenly, who we say is essential is completely different from the way we act in ordinary times, right? And this is a fascinating move. Actually, I'll tell you, I did interviews with hundreds of people for this book, and one of the fascinating things that people kept saying is, like, I knew the pandemic was real and this crisis was going to be serious when they stopped playing NBA games. Right? There's like the big night was like, oh, they canceled the NBA games, and it was like, oh my God, this has to be a real thing, right? And so it turned out that those guys were not the essential workers. This other cast of characters were. So now, in a way, if we step back, we kind of know this is true anyway. Like we shouldn't really need the crisis to do this. But what happened in the crisis, when we were worried about survival, is that we spoke the open secret, right? The thing that we kind of know in our hearts, we all said it. It became part of government policy, right? It was out there in the world as this like new thing. So one could imagine that when a society says there's some people who are essential, that what comes with that designation is, you know, it's an honorific, right? We say thank you. You could imagine like extra compensation. You could imagine a guarantee of really good health care. You could imagine PPE, like you get a mask, right? You could imagine some collective thank you afterwards. And there's some industry, I have a friend here who works with farm workers, and they figured this out, and they tried to leverage this politically. Like, okay, if we're essential, then let's talk about it. But for the most part, at the national level, we didn't do that. And the way I think about it, it's like, as a society, it's like we walked to the edge, this moral precipice, and just at the moment when it looked like we were going to have a breakthrough, and maybe some of you felt, I felt there are moments in 2020 where it really felt like, wait a minute, like there might be a better world that comes after. Did anyone have that feeling? Like we're saying all this, like shit's going on that like we don't ordinarily say. And just when we got to that, it was like we faced that thing and we're like, nah, forget about that. And it's gone. I mean, that's the thing that's so striking to me. Like we said this thing about who's essential. We all acknowledged this thing together. And it's taken a lot of work to pretend that none of that happened. But that's like, so that for me, that's like one big thing that got revealed that I think is important. I want to give you one other one that's like one of my favorite, and it has to do with the issue of masks. Because like one would think that, hypothetically, you live in a world where there's this new pathogen, and it causes a disease that's, deadly in a pretty decent size, proportion of people. So even 2%, 1%, there's almost 8 billion people in the world. That's like a scary thing. It's a scary thing. So you would think in that situation that if there was a simple technology that could reduce the spread of the disease and that had worked in other situations like this, that people would just do it. People would just wear a mask, right? We have this technology, it's called the mask. People have done it. And there are a bunch of societies on Earth that have a history of wearing masks. Like a lot of Asian societies have a century or more of wearing masks in viral emergencies and even during ordinary times. And I learned kind of reading into medical history and the anthropology of health that in a number of Asian societies, it's like the mask is a mark of scientific progress. It's also kind of a way of establishing solidarity. Like one of the things that's interesting is often in Japan, say, people wear a mask not because they're trying to avoid getting sick themselves, but because they don't want other people to get sick when they're feeling sick. And then there are a whole set of countries that were affected by SARS in 2003, and they learned from SARS, and they developed these plans that had to do with like making sure they had PPE, and they were ready, like Australia and New Zealand and Canada too, they were ready to subsidize the production of masks and the distribution of masks. They had a whole program for this. Then there are a bunch of societies, including like the US and the UK, that don't have a lot of experience with masks. And it's really interesting, like in the US and the UK, like about a pretty similar proportion of people wore masks. Actually, we collectively wore masks a little bit more than they did in the UK. But there's one really fascinating difference, and that is that in the UK, whether or not you wore a mask had nothing to do with political ideology. Your political preference had nothing to do about it. But in the United States, it got very political. And I wanted to figure, like, well, how did this happen? You remember how political the whole mask thing was? So I looked into it, and I don't know if you follow the story, but what happens is that in the first few months of the pandemic, the World Health Organization does not recommend that people get masks. And there's a debate about why. At first, they were just really concerned that there weren't enough of them, and they were worried that people who work in hospitals and the care industries wouldn't have access to this critical technology for maintaining health. There's also some question because the WHO was saying, well, we don't know that this specific coronavirus is going to be stopped by a mask. It might be that it works for other coronaviruses, maybe not for this one. We want to see the evidence. And of course, it was a new virus. That didn't stop people in China and Singapore and Japan and Australia and New Zealand from wearing masks, but it gave the WHO pause. So it wasn't until the end of March and the beginning of April that we had enough specific research on this new coronavirus that the CDC changed its message and put out new guidelines saying, we're recommending that Americans wear masks in public. And the person who announces this new CDC policy is the previous president. And he does this on April 3rd. And he has this amazing press conference where he says like quite responsibly, today the CDC has changed its policy and they're advising all Americans to wear masks when they're in public settings around other people. And then he says, and some of you might remember this, he says, personally, I'm not going to do it. It's a choice, and I don't really think I need to do it, right? And that's kind of like a startling message. And in my book, you should know, I kind of break from the standard metrics that we use to tell the story of like who's successful and who wasn't successful in the pandemic. I mean, deaths and disease are part of it, but also like distrust and dysfunction and confusion and chaos are a big part of it. And when the president announces the new public health plan from the chief epidemiological authority, and at the same time also says, I'm not doing it, that can't help but sow confusion. But here's where it gets even more interesting. So the next thing that happens is in the president's inner circle, the administration, it becomes clear to people that, as he sees it, to wear a mask is to look scared, cowardly, right? Weak, feminine, all things he doesn't like. And everybody in the inner circle, even people with health issues, realize like the price of the ticket is to not, is to just bury your face. And the peak moment for this publicly is Mike Pence. Do you remember Mike Pence? Remember Mike Pence? So Mike Pence was the vice president. Oh wait, he wasn't just the vice president. Do you remember? Mike Pence at this time is also the chair of the White House task force on COVID. Remember that? Most countries had people who were like health experts. We had Mike Pence. So here's what Mike Pence does. He goes to this really happened. Tell me if you're like this. I'm not making stuff up here. This is a work of nonfiction. He goes to the Mayo Clinic. Do you remember this? The Mayo Clinic. You go to the Mayo Clinic if you have a really complicated health condition and your doctors at home can't solve it. So it's serious stuff, and it's like peak pandemic, and Mike Pence is the only person in the zip code who's not wearing a mask. Doctors, nurses, really sick people, and Mike Pence is there smiling for the cameras. Okay, so it's become clear that like now, to bury your face is to show your political allegiance. And now I don't know anything about who you are, what your politics are, but probably some of you are feeling like, yeah, those guys, that team's so terrible, can you believe they did this thing? But now I want us to think about what happened with the other team, because it's real, like it's just sociologically, not politically, sociologically, it's so fascinating. So what happens with the other team is there's a group of people who feel like this is horrible, we have this technology, and the mask can really help. And not only can it help like substantively, but like to wear a mask is to symbolize your commitment to solidarity. You recognize that our fate is tied to the fate of the people around us. It's about mutual obligation. And so, like Tom Frank, the great political writer, he goes on Facebook and he changes his Facebook image. It's like Tom Frank is now wearing a mask. Any of you have friends who's changed their Facebook image on time? Yeah, okay. And then Michael Bracey changes his Twitter handle is now like Michael #wears a mask Bracey, right? Because it's very everyone to know. And again, like it's a counter model to what was happening in the federal government, but like we're now really expressing this thing. Okay, so now Joe Biden's running for office, Kamala Harris is running for office. We got all these Democrats and progressives. They start making television advertisements wearing masks, posters wearing masks. Remember this? And so suddenly, the mask is not just a health device, it's a symbol for which side you are. It's a totem, is what the anthropologists call it. It's like you're expressing something about who you are by wearing a mask, right? And it's kind of an amazing thing. So it's like we now have all of the weight of our political division is loaded into this little piece of fabric that we put on our face. And I know you remember this. We start going after each other in public. And there's this moment, and we analyzed like thousands of videos in the book. I have a team of researchers working with me on this because like there's so many of them I couldn't couldn't do it by myself. Do you remember these viral videos start to pop up of like 70-year-old women in Walmart screaming at each other, brawling in the aisle, a dude somewhere like body slams someone else. Several people get shot and killed in conflicts about masks. Like when we open up the airplanes, we're fighting in the airplanes. Like this thing happens and by the way, this does not happen in other places, right? This is an American thing. And so I think it's really like, I'm not trying to say the mask people were wrong or the barefaced people. Like, I was a mask guy, you know, still wear a mask occasionally. Like, but what happened is that this whole thing turned into something more. And then, right, so first it was masks, and then it was, if you're a Democrat, you get remdesivir if you have COVID. If you're a Republican, you get hydrochlor, can anyone say that? Horse medicine, you know. I have friends who take it for other things, but like, remember that whole thing? And then it was the vaccine, right? Which like Trump could have claimed the vaccine as his thing, right? He could say like that was Operation Warp Speed. He could have called like one of them Ivana, one of them Ivanka, right? They could have had these. He could have been like, right? We could have had Trump on every mask in America, but he didn't. But by the time the FDA approved it, he had already lost the election, and he didn't want the new President Biden to get credit for it, so he wouldn't get vaccinated on television, right? He wouldn't do all these things. So then like there was a Democratic way of dealing with vaccines and a Republican way of dealing with vaccines, and then there was like a Democratic take on the legitimacy of the election and a Republican take on the illegitimacy of the election. Do you see how this kind of like spiraled? And there are all these things that happened in 2020 that were so powerful and formative and that are still part of our political culture, and we're just ignoring them, and it's not working. Like we're not getting through them because we're ignoring them.
I always thought it was particularly poor marketing to get people to wear masks by saying that wearing a mask protects other people. I was like, that is a bad strategy in the United States.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It works in other places, and what you're bringing up, I think, is an issue that also is threaded through the book, and it's this tension between the kind of hyper-individualistic strain in American culture and this kind of communitarian view of solidarity. And it's easy to say that we're a hyper-individualistic society, which we are, like on many measures. When social scientists look at cultures that are individualistic versus cultures that are collective, we rank pretty high on the individualistic front. But there's also this strain of kind of community, local action, civic participation. That's the stuff that when Tocqueville came to the United States, he observed, centuries ago. And that remains a hallmark of American life. Like, we are joiners in ways that people aren't in other places. And there was a battle between these ideas in the United States. And I think, one problem we had is, the hyper-individualism stuff really worked for one side. And when you're going through a collective crisis or a collective crises, if half the squad is individualistic about it, the whole thing kind of breaks down. Like you can't really do it if only half the people are participating. And so solidarity really got strained in that situation. But you're making a great point. It's notable that in other places, protecting other people might have been a powerful message.
Yeah, no, ideally it would be. You touched upon people screaming at each other on airplanes. The last chapter of your book is called American Enemy, which I found really particularly fascinating. So anomie, of course, is this the social condition defined by sort of a breakdown of moral values and order. And you describe that while maybe COVID outcomes were similar in the U.S. and Canada and other countries that had maybe better protections early on, the things that spiraled out of control in this country, like gun violence. You talk a lot about car crashes and reckless driving and just other chaotic acts as sort of these uniquely American byproducts of the pandemic. So can you just elaborate a little bit on that? I thought that was really one of the most interesting things of the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. I thought this was fascinating stuff to study and try to puzzle out. And I mean, I think it is notable that deaths were substantially higher in the U.S. than they were in Canada. It's so hard to get the facts right on this, but like we did do worse, and we did worse than a lot of our peer countries. We didn't do worse than any other place on Earth in terms of deaths per capita, but in terms of excess deaths, we did really badly. There's a chapter in the book where I look at the first thing that a bunch of different countries on Earth do when they find out there's a coronavirus, and I compare the US to the UK and Australia, because these are three countries. They're all kind of grouped together in terms of their individualism, their small L liberalism, their capitalist countries. Actually, all three have right-wing populist leaders at the beginning of 2020. Scott Morrison, who's the Prime Minister in Australia, at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, he is, Australia's got these catastrophic bushfires, like massive fires, and he's denying that it has anything to do with climate change. He doesn't want anyone in the ministry talking about climate change, so he's kind of like a science-denying right-winger. And the discourse in Australia is about this crisis of polarization and distrust. In other words, it sounds a lot like America, right? But when COVID starts, now they've been touched by SARS in 2003, and they have this infrastructure they've set up. And Morrison says, look, I'm going to get this group of my ministers together. We're going to get the heads of all 6 states and the territories. We're going to have a commission led by the health experts. And it's also a federalist country, so they can have a national policy and state policies. And they subsidize masks. They subsidize distribution. They do testing and tracing. They close the border. They have far more extensive shutdowns than we have in the United States. In Victoria, where Melbourne is, it becomes controversial for being so excessive. But Australia, over the course of 2020, here's the first thing to know. They have less death than they do in a typical year. So like if the US had Australia's mortality rate in the pandemic, 900,000 Americans would still be alive today. And there's a way in which we sometimes say, oh, all these countries did badly, but Australia was, for all the reasons that the US was primed to have a really bad pandemic, so was Australia. 900,000 excess deaths, in the US by comparison. But the other thing that's really remarkable to me is that despite the fact that there were protests in Victoria and the lockdowns were hard and not everybody agreed with the measures they took, trust levels in Australia went up over the course of the pandemic. Trust in government, trust in scientists, trust in other people. And in the United States, they plummeted. This is during the year 2020. So it's interesting because animate this idea that there's a loss of moral order due to this disruption in everyday social routines. That should have happened all over the world, right? We actually really did not have extensive lockdowns by comparative standards in the US. Like if you know anybody who lives in France or Italy or Spain or China or Australia, or Belize, to ask them about the lockdowns they had. We didn't really have lockdowns by any means. We closed the schools for a long time, but we didn't really have lockdowns. But we did have this incredible spike in violence. Now the first order thing is well, we have guns. Okay, so guns explain a lot of guns is a good explanation for a lot of what's wrong in the country, and guns made it more deadly. But we were unique in the sense that we had this incredible spike in reckless driving, in vehicular homicide. There are all these things we did that displayed hyper-individualism, a lack of regard for other people. Not only am I not going to wear my mask to help you out, but get out of the way of my Hummer, was the mantra of the country. And when we started just driving with the sense that we just didn't care. And that's really striking. And this is not a book that has a lot to say about formal politics and the previous president. I mean, there's some things to say about it. I've said most of them already here tonight. But one thing we know about the world is that when there's a novel situation and there's a lot of uncertainty, people really do look to leaders for guidance. And this was a moment when, I think our leaders whipped up anger and distrust and division, right, in all kinds of ways, formally and informally, from Jared Kushner having the states bid against each other for medical equipment instead of having a federal plan, to the president announcing the CDC policy and then saying, I'm not going to do it. We were led in a way that made us turn against each other. And that's a thing I worry about for 2024. Like the level of divisiveness here is incredibly high. So.
We're going to run out of time, and there's still a big part of this book that we need to talk about. The 7 stories, 7 individuals. So not only is this book about everything that Eric's been talking about, this is a collective biography of 7 remarkable but ordinary New Yorkers. Heart-wrenching. This is some of the most heart-wrenching writing in the book, reading about some of these people and what they went through in those first few weeks, months. First of all, can you tell me why you decided to write about these 7 people in particular? Who are they, and what do their stories help us understand, I guess?
Yeah, so I want to do that, and I want to say I think that I'm glad that some of them are heart-wrenching. I think also several of them are actually really inspiring.
Absolutely,
and, I think just to make sure that you get a feel for that, I want to talk about a couple of or at least one of the very inspiring ones, because the book isn't just a story of things falling apart. So we actually stitched together some things in a pretty amazing way in 2020, and we need to remember that too. So the reason I did it this way is that all these things that I'm talking to you about, like trying to understand why the United States went this way and not the other way, and essential workers and spikes in violence and masks, like they all really appealed to the social scientist part of my brain that likes to find puzzles and solve the puzzles, with really good answers. And so it was very satisfying to do that work. But there's another part of me that's like the rest of my body, which is like the dad who's got the kid who's, in bed with what's surely COVID and is terrified because I don't know what to do, or the, son of older people who are suddenly very isolated and afraid, or the colleague of people who are dying and the neighbor of people who are sick. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I felt, and I don't know how does this make sense? Did you all feel this stuff? Let me just ask a quick show of hands. How many of you feel like you have really processed what you lived through in 2020 at this point? Like you've thought about it a lot, you've worked through it. Just raise your hand really high if you feel like you really processed, you feel good about it. Okay, so we have, it started as 1, now we're up to 4. Okay, so it's like, that's a very consistent number here when I ask the raisers. So about 4 people here have really processed it, which is amazing. So I felt like I had not. And I felt like a lot of stuff was like pushed away. And one of the amazing things that happened to me during the 2020 is I discovered Netflix. You guys have Netflix? Anybody have Netflix? Great. So I watched these movies on Netflix, and in the really good movies, there are these great characters, and I would follow the characters, and I'd find myself getting really invested in characters. When the things happen in characters' lives, I often found myself thinking about like my life or my family life or my friend's life. That's kind of one of the things that happens when we watch a good movie or read a good novel, right? It's like we start to live through the experiences of other people. And I realized that there's this tradition in sociology also, which is about like deep understanding. It's not just like data analysis, but like really deeply understanding people by spending time in different places, observing them, interviewing them. And around the time that the pandemic started, I was working on my first profile for the New Yorker magazine of not a pandemic story, someone else, but I was like working on a deep story about one person. I found it really rewarding. And it occurred to me, I kind of like learned this genre, and it occurred to me that the only way I was really going to be able to unlock those things inside of me and the things that I felt like were unlocked in my world was by like getting outside of the analytic stuff and really getting deep into the lives of people. And my first impulse was I want to do this all around the world because it's a global book in some ways, but then COVID. So I couldn't get out of New York, basically. Like all the borders were, I couldn't leave the country. But I realized like what an amazing place to be, New York, because the world was in New York. And so I came up with a strategy, which is I wanted to find somebody in every borough, so one person from each borough, whose story in some way spoke to broader trends in the borough. So I can't say like my Brooklyn character represents Brooklyn. That would be ludicrous. But like, I wanted to find someone whose story spoke to a broader trend. And I found someone whose life I would follow through 2020, so I could reconstruct the story. And then I had to think like, well, what am I missing? And first thing I realized is like, well, by following someone's story through the year 2020, I missed the story of someone who died in the beginning of the pandemic. And so I reached out to the MTA, where a lot of people died, and they connected me to a family of a guy who's an Indian immigrant who was a physicist and a mathematician who spent 30 years living in New York and working as a custodian in the subway system, so his kids could get an education and opportunities, and his kids kind of helped me reconstruct his story. And so Matai Tankachan is there. And then if any of you are holding the book, the guy who's on the cover is a guy named Brandon English. And his story, for him, 2020, I think the title of that chapter is "COVID Was Not My Only Concern," or "COVID Was Not My Real Concern." Like, his story was about the protests. And he's a fascinating guy. He's a 6'6" black man who's a political photographer. He grew up in the South. What he likes to do for his work is go to like KKK rallies and take photographs, which is like a thing to do if you're a 6'6" black man. And like, he just wanted to be in the mix, and he spent his year like in the mix in these protests, and he had a lot to say and an amazing story. And like, the way the book works structurally is that you kind of go back and forth between the stories of the people and these puzzles that I've been working out for you. And I know we're getting late. Can I just tell you about Nuala really fast before we
Yeah,
go?
please.
I want to do questions, but I want to tell you about one person at least, just because of the nature of our conversation and because I think her story is so relevant. One of the people who's really stuck with me is this woman named Nuala O'Doherty, and she represents Queens in the book. She's from a family of Irish immigrants. She's the only person who was born in the U.S. Everyone else is Irish immigrant. She moved to New York for high school. She went to St. John's for law school. She moved to Astoria, Queens, fell in love with an Ecuadorian guy who was an auto technician, and they raised their family together in Jackson Heights. Anyone, can you raise your hand if you know Jackson Heights? Okay, a lot of Jackson Heights. So Jackson Heights is distinctive and kind of famous in the world because some people think of it as the most diverse place on the planet. This one neighborhood, they speak something like 160 languages. It's amazing, and it's very densely packed. It's very, very crowded apartments. Very immigrant, kind of informal economy is big there. And Nuala had been involved in the neighborhood for years, as an activist parent, gardening club. Like, she's just a joiner. You all know joiners. She got a big Post-it note, and she wrote on it. She got a big Post-it note, and she wrote on it like, "If you need help, call me." And she wrote her personal phone number, and then she Xeroxed it, and she had her like children and volunteers in her campaign put up posters around Jackson Heights. And the next day there were like dozens of calls, and then suddenly there were hundreds of calls, and there were so many calls that it was like impossible to deal with the situation because there were so many people who needed something, right? And then she came up with this other idea. She got another poster, and it said, "If you can help, call me." Dozens of people, and then hundreds of people. And what she did is, she started this thing she called the COVID Care Neighborhood Network, which is, what we now call a mutual aid network. And she started it in the basement of her home in Jackson Heights. She converted it into, so you had got people to make diaper deliveries, buying diapers, diaper donations. They started getting food bags together, different foods for different ethnic groups. They were taking phone calls from people who needed help with what do you do if both parents have COVID and you've got a kid or you've got an older person, or what do you do if you can't get to the pharmacy and you need some medication? Who can get me toilet paper? They just got organized, and within a few days, this amazing network of people who were really different, who didn't know each other all that well beforehand, were showing up at Nuala's house every morning, and people had different roles, and they had this mutual aid network going, and their projects evolved as other groups started to pick up the feeding people problem. They dealt with the fact that even though there was a moratorium on evictions, there were some landlords who thought, well, like, my tenants aren't going to know about that, and they tried to evict people. So Nuala had legal expertise, and she was helping to make sure people could stay in their apartments. And then when the vaccines came out, she was trying to get people access to vaccines. And then people were going crazy because they were in their little apartments too long. And Jackson Heights is a little bit of a green desert, and they organized and they did this open streets campaign, and they got a big avenue transformed into an open street. It's still an open street to this day. And so they did all this incredible stuff together. And there's her chapters in there. And it's important for us to remember, like, this is not just a Jackson Heights story. Like, there are mutual aid networks in every neighborhood of New York City, probably every neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston, and Dallas and Houston and Atlanta and Memphis and California too. It's a thing that people around the world did when the government proved unable to react quickly enough or generously enough to deal with the situation. And it's a really important legacy of what happened in 2020. And it's not just a legacy of an idea, and this will be the last thing I say, maybe we'll go to questions. New York Magazine asked if they could excerpt the chapter that's about Nuala. It's called The Bridge. And they said, like, just because we're a magazine, we want to update it a little bit. So before we print it, can you just call Nuala and find out, what she's up to? And this is like a few weeks ago. Like, the book came out 3 weeks ago. This is like the week before. So I call Nuala, and this is just amazing. So probably some of you have read that there's 150,000 new migrants in New York City. Have you read about this? Like, we have an enormous surge of migrants in the city right now, and it really is changed the city. It's put a lot of pressure on a lot of institutions, a lot of neighborhoods, and created a lot of challenges for the migrants themselves and for people trying to take care of them and for people who wish they weren't there. There's a sense that the city has been being transformed. And Nuala said, you haven't heard what I'm doing? And I said, no. And she said, okay, well, here's what happened. I'm married to an Ecuadorian guy, and he's got a cousin whose cousin is friends with a woman who just got here from Ecuador. And she needed help. And she called and she said, I'm trying to file these asylum papers, because there's if you file your asylum papers, if you don't get a response after 6 months, you get a Social Security card. And so she asked me if I would help. And so I did. I told her I didn't know anything about asylum law, but I'll try to help. So she brought the forms over, and when we were finished, she said, oh, do you mind if I tell a friend about you? And she said, okay. And then she told a friend, and then another friend, and then a couple weeks later, this is a true story, at 4 in the morning, there's people sleeping outside of her house, waiting to knock on the door to see if she'll help. So she sets up a thing, and right now, the same basement that was the Jackson Heights or the COVID Care Neighborhood Network, that same basement in Nuala's house is the Jackson Heights Immigration Center. And every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 60 people, I'm not kidding, you can look at the photographs in New York Magazine, 60 people file into her basement, as many as can possibly fit, and she starts at 10 a.m. and she does a 90-minute lecture, which is kind of welcome to New York, we're all New Yorkers, here's what it's like to live in New York, you need to make community, you need to learn English, and then at 11:30, she takes a little break, and from then on until about 1 in the morning, the people who used to volunteer in COVID Care Neighborhood Network, a bunch of migrants who've gone through a thing, they spend the rest of the day helping people fill out the paperwork so they can file for asylum. And she does it every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Tuesday, Thursday, in the basement, she does English language conversation groups. And when I spoke to her, she had already crossed more than 2,000 families whose paperwork she had helped file. No money, no grants or anything. And what it reminded me of is that there is, as a consequence of what we lived through in 2020, a kind of invisible civic infrastructure that's part of Jackson Heights and part of New York City and part of Washington, part of a lot of different places. And I can't imagine what it would have been like for people to try to make it through New York. this last year without that, and I don't know the range of things that they're doing. But at the same time that we worry about the chaos and confusion and the hyper-individualism, I think it's important for us to remember, so that we don't get despondent about the situation, that there are also an enormous number of people who are involved in doing stuff like this, right? And there's a reason that our elections are always really close. There are a lot of people who are going to bare their faces and drive recklessly in the metaphorical sense of that term. But there are a lot of other people who are going to keep on wearing masks, and wearing masks because they want to make sure that other people don't get sick. And that's something that I really learned from Nula's story. That's what I'd say. All right, thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got time for a few questions. I don't think we've got one or two questions. Just remember to make sure that they're questions as opposed to comments, followed by questions. Over in the back, yes? No, you yes.
There's a microphone
Use the
coming
microphone.
on your right side, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. I read your book, Going Solo, when it first came out, and although you're trying to make us hopeful, I'm just wondering how much of that research that you did, finding out about people kind of in retrenchment, has informed current American society and not being able to be cohesive enough to take care of all the things we need to do and have the discussions we need.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Very succinct and good question. So I wrote a book several years ago, more than a decade ago, about the fact that more Americans are living alone than ever before, and I thought that was a fascinating demographic trend that we didn't really understand. One of the things I found in that book that surprised me very much, because when I first started, I thought it was the story of social isolation and decline of society, but I learned that actually the overwhelming majority of people who live alone are quite social, and that in fact, people living alone tend to spend more time with friends and with neighbors than people who are married. They're more likely to volunteer in civic organizations. There's a social life that I didn't quite understand, and there's a part of the book that emphasizes just how dangerous it can be to live alone if you're prone to loneliness and depression and you get isolated, but I don't conflate them. And because I was thinking about that situation for this book, one of the chapters deals with the question of what happened to people who were living alone in the pandemic, when suddenly being alone didn't come with all these social opportunities anymore. And with a graduate student, we did about 50 interviews, and it was really, really fascinating. And I'm going to give you a succinct answer. What we learned is that people who were living alone, even during the hardest periods of the lockdowns, they actually didn't feel lonely in the conventional sense. They didn't complain about loneliness. They said, I'm talking to my friends and family like I never did before, and I have the sense of living through something with other people. There's a way in which our lives are in sync. But what they said, which is very common as part of what I learned from all the interviews, is the feeling was not that they were lonely, it's they felt like they were on their own. And in a recent essay I wrote, I called this structural isolation. It's the feeling how are you going to handle all the challenges and responsibilities of this moment when the economy is up in the air? Figure it out yourself, right? And I think that was a very common experience. I think that's one of the things that unites people on the left and the right in the United States is people feel that at a moment when push came to shove, the response was not. It wasn't totally you're on your own. We reduced child poverty like never before. We had a stimulus plan. We did a lot of things to help some people, but there was so much uncertainty around all of it, and it took such a long time to come. I think a lot of Americans felt less lonely, more on our own.
Okay. One more? Guys, is this okay? No? All right, well,
No.
we've got a whole YouTube thing.
We can talk over by the books.
We can talk over by the
by the
books.
books.
Thank you all for coming. Huge round of applause for Eric.
Thank you.
It is an amazing book. I mean, it is just a profoundly important, fantastic book. And I don't just say that because I'm a librarian. I truly mean it. You will enjoy it and you will share it. And we are so indebted to you for this, for what you've done for libraries with Palaces of the People and everything else that you've done. So keep up the great work, and we'll see you here next time. Thank you. Thanks so much. That was great.